Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the final lecture series of this term's faculty lecture series. As a classic academic paper, which doesn't end with a conclusion but with an outlook, we invited today Karel Klein to give an outlook or a talk about the new relation between AI, creativity, design, architecture practice. Karel Klein is the co-director of Klein, an experimental and cutting-edge architecture practice based in New York and Los Angeles. More to her academic side. So Karel Klein graduated from Columbia University in one of the first let's say cutting-edge design studios, or like related to the paperless studio at the time, which were involving or bringing critical thinking or merging critical thinking with that what you understood at this time as digital. And I think that this is exactly this kind of essence what she carried on, or carries on always through her work. Karel is teaching at several places. She taught studios at Columbia University, at the Pratt Institute, at the UCLD and the AUD. And she currently teaches at Washington University Sam Fox School and the Southern California Institute of Architecture and the University of Pennsylvania Weizmann School of Design. In her more recent work, now she, of course, fully embeds artificial intelligence. And I thought I'm for sure not so good as an AI speaker in really introducing her work or her today's talk, because the introduction of her talk is relates to Homer. So I asked ChatGPT to rewrite her CV in relation to her talk in the words of Homer. In Carrier's long stretch, Karel did devote to architecture's growth her mind and hand. To AI's frontier, she then set sail to blend with human thought a union grand. Her project probes the scope of images born from algorithms' depth where myths takes from. In architecture's realm, with words and styles, their rich and storied past she doth transform. By Callio's diagonal signs stirred, and Breton's wondrous thoughts, her spirit flies to re-enchant the space where structures dwell, with AI's touch, the sensual and surprise. In deep poetic strokes, her work conveys new bonds twixt built world and realms unseen. In Verto Pelis, Sayak's off-ramp breeds a marriage of the text and tectonic sheen. Today we gather here to hear her speak, sing goddess she entreats with Homer's grace. A mechanized muse, AI she'll unveil, as creativists said in art's embrace. Let us extend our warmth, our joy, our praise to Karel Klein, esteemed, who shares her sight. In lectures form her wisdom we shall glean on AI, creativity, and architecture's light. Welcome to Karel Klein.
Thanks, that was pretty awesome. Makes me wish that I rewrote, because I wrote the whole lecture, it makes me wish I rewrote it as Homer. It might be a little tedious to listen to, like 45 minutes of Homer, but that's epic. That would be epic poetry, no? So thanks very much for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. I'm very honored to have the chance to share some thoughts and images with you today. Sing goddess. I love the sound of these two words, sing goddess. They're somewhat mysterious and perhaps a bit provocative, and it's what I wanted to title an essay that I wrote last summer. However, to my profound disappointment, the title of that essay was changed. So I thought I would take advantage of this invitation for this lecture today to resurrect it. It occurs to me, though, that the title might be a touch obscure. What do I mean by it? And what does it have to do with artificial intelligence and those things that might be created with the help of artificial intelligence? Sing goddess, 2 words that begin the Iliad, that ancient and epic poem ascribed to the Greek poet Homer. Within this poetic invocation, Homer beckons the Muses, divine entities revered for their capacity to inspire artists, seeking their aid in the construction of his extraordinary work. Homer's appeal here underscores the long-standing belief that humans rely on external, often enigmatic, sources of inspiration to generate exceptional creations in music, painting, literature, and architecture. I started using artificial intelligence for the production of images in 2017 and began teaching with it the same year at University of Pennsylvania. From the very beginning, I have been captivated by the peculiar, otherworldly beauty of AI-generated images and have, through teaching and writing and making, sought to comprehend the strange qualities they possess. Recently, I have tried to make persuasive arguments about their unusual aesthetics and the role AI plays as a prosthetic imagination. So I want to use 2 recently written essays to talk today about the image, the imaginal, and the imagination, and to perhaps offer a novel theory of imagination, positioning AI as an external catalyst for creative expression, a mechanized muse, so to speak. The 2 essays I want to discuss today are these: Machines Are Braver Than Art and Machines à Rechercher. The first, Machines Are Braver Than Art, considers an essay by the writer Donald Barthelme entitled Not Knowing. Donald Barthelme is an American so-called postmodern writer of fiction, known best for his experimental use of language and structure. He also wrote my favorite short story called The Balloon, and I often assign it to my students to read just because I like it so much, because it's so good. It's a story about New York City and about architecture and about the architecture of a balloon, and I highly recommend it to all of you too. But that's a digression. The essay Not Knowing is a brilliantly clever analysis of creativity. In it, Barthelme explores the concept of not knowing as an essential aspect of writing and of all creative work. He argues for embracing uncertainty, suggesting that the best work comes from a place of doubt rather than a place of understanding. I use this essay for the training of a StyleGAN model. That is, I use it to literally produce images based on aspects of the text, and to speculate on Barthelme's arguments of ambiguity and the unknown when suddenly it is a machine rather than a human doing the creating. In case some of you are unfamiliar with StyleGAN training, let me quickly tell you what it is. StyleGAN is a generative AI model that uses machine learning and is trained on very large quantities of images, from which it learns to generate unique images that resemble its training data. If I were to train a StyleGAN model with images of coffee cups, for instance, I'd show it thousands and thousands of images of different coffee cups until it understood the coffee cup well enough to produce its own unique image of a coffee cup. And this is the same AI algorithm that I'm using to generate the images in this lecture. And it is the unique properties of this kind of image generating process that I write about in these essays and that I'm speaking to you about today. So the second essay I want to share with you and try to tie aspects of it with the first is Machines à Rechercher. This essay considers Marcel Proust's ideas on memory and Sigmund Freud's concept of the working through of memory in relation to AI-generated images. Again, specifically images produced by trained StyleGAN models. You guys probably know Marcel Proust was a French novelist, best known for his monumental work In Search of Lost Time. Originally published as 7 volumes, it's the longest novel ever written and ends up on a lot of bucket lists of books to read. the thing that I'll read before I die. It's considered one of the greatest literary achievements in history. The novel is characterized by Proust's concept of involuntary memory, or mémoire involontaire, in which seemingly insignificant sensory experiences can trigger profound recollections, which he then transcribes and elaborates on in his extraordinary prose. It is this text and his notions of mémoire involontaire that I argue has an analog to the qualities of remembering, aesthetic in nature, that AI exhibits after it has been trained to know something and thus to ultimately remember something. Before I delve deeper into these ideas, you've probably noticed that I tend to invoke literature quite often as a source of insight for investigating the weird aesthetic properties of these AI-produced images. And this might make you suspicious. Literature seems so unlike the visual arts and architecture. Any imagery related to literature occurs only in the mind's eye, doesn't it? But so many terms that we use to describe the peculiar and particular qualities of the images that we're interested in are literary in nature. Uncanny, for instance. Uncanny refers to the sensation one experiences upon encountering something that is simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar. It is a sensation often associated with feelings of unease, yet despite this sense of unease, or perhaps because of it, one finds oneself drawn to the uncanny. And yet the concept of the uncanny is rooted in the literary. Defined by Freud in his 1919 essay called The Uncanny, he also uses stories to describe and illustrate this concept and argues that the uncanny sensation is most often located in the literary. However, as architects, I think we often aspire to conjure sensations of the uncanny in our own work. And then there is convulsive beauty, another term that is particularly appropriate in describing aesthetic aspects of these AI-produced images. It is a term coined by André Breton, an author and the founder of Surrealism, a movement that was first and foremost a literary movement and only secondarily a visual art movement. Convulsive beauty, according to Breton, refers to a particular aesthetic experience characterized by paradox. The so-called fixed explosive was one category of convulsive beauty. This might describe something like an object that hovered at the threshold between the immobile and mobile, convulsed, so to speak, between the animate and inanimate. This property, not entirely unlike the uncanny, was also seen to be unsettling and offered glimpses into the surrealist aesthetics of the irrational unconscious. But it's not just the literary terms that make literature such a potent analog for the aesthetic sensations produced by these AI images. Written works can evoke mind's eye imagery, sensations, and experiences that one longs for in the experience of architecture and of the world. Arthur Machen calls this ecstasy, a state of heightened perception and awareness that allows one to experience a reality otherwise obscured by day-to-day existence. This more meaningful reality differs from our ordinary experiences in that one becomes more sensitive to profundity and beauty, more sensitive to the sublime. Machen argues that true art, and especially literature, has the power to evoke this sense of ecstasy. And if I'm drawn to literature and to these strangely beautiful AI-produced images, it's for that sense of ecstasy. And it's because, as an architect, I want architecture to induce the ecstatic state as well. And so I interrogate the AI images in the hope that they will offer me insight into this matter. So we begin, as Donald Barthelme begins in his essay, Not Knowing, with a list of ingredients reminiscent of a recipe. 1 azalea bush, 1 gold pocket watch, 1 handsome thief, and 1 chastity belt. To assemble, position the azalea bush in the park, wind the watch, place both it and the thief beneath the bush with the chastity belt securely locked onto the thief. As the elements in the scene are laid out in anticipation of what might come next, Barthelme embraces the problem of imagination that we all face, of the uncertainty of what to do next. This state of not knowing, he argues, is what enables art to be created. It allows the mind to brood and bud and is essential for invention. This territory of uncertainty is brimming with possibility, and it is the unique property of language, with its remarkable combinatorial agility and its ability to endlessly produce meaning, that allows the inexplicable to linger long after the not knowing has become known. And I was curious to think harder about StyleGAN models and their training because, like language, they too have an astonishing combinatorial agility and the ability to suggest endless possible meaning. I was curious to use StyleGAN to model an aspect of imagination by offering AI those same elements, the pocket watch, the azalea bush, the handsome thief, and his chastity belt. I thought I'd ask AI to produce something like a fiction, and so the question became this: how does this concept of not knowing, an essential element of creativity, function when the desired knowledge lacks a knower? William H. Gass writes that, quote, "the purpose of literature is to capture consciousness." And that's such a beautiful quote, to capture consciousness. And it makes one wonder what happens when there's no consciousness to capture. In other words, what is it that artificial intelligence doesn't know here? And what kind of imagination can its peculiar form of not knowing give rise to? And so I offered AI those same elements. I built a library of thousands of images of azalea bushes, pocket watches, handsome thieves, and chastity belts. And I used this library of carefully curated images to train a StyleGAN model. What's important to remember and consider here is that when Barthelme presents us with the thief, the bush, and the rest, he takes them from, quote, "the world of conventional signs." When Barthelme refers to a pocket watch, he relies on our shared understanding of what a pocket watch is within our cultural context. When we read the words gold pocket watch, we can immediately picture one in our mind's eye. We don't hesitate to consider the characteristics or features that might distinguish one gold pocket watch from another. On the contrary, we are quite satisfied with the knowledge of the idea of the pocket watch. This understanding, which is part of the world of conventional signs, allows us to grasp the concept of a pocket watch without having to know any specific details about a particular one. In semiotics, this shared understanding is based on the relationship between the signifier, the word pocket watch, and the signified, the mental concept and image of a pocket watch. However, if we were to train an AI StyleGAN on pocket watches, it would no doubt be able to produce an image of something resembling a pocket watch, and it would do so convincingly and with ease, but it would not recognize it as such. A StyleGAN model trained on pocket watches will never know the meaning of a pocket watch. It will never know it semiotically as a sign or a symbol. Instead, it would focus on the visual aspects and patterns found in the training images and try to replicate them. It would learn to reproduce aspects like shininess, roundness, reflectivity, or those little tiny marks on what we might call its face. This highlights the limitations of AI when it comes to understanding objects in the way humans do. But this limitation is exactly how the AI can operate as an exceedingly unusual faculty of imagination. A model of imagination unique perhaps to the machine or to the machine-human collaborative hybrid. This world of conventional signs that encompasses language, and especially the words that are the names of things, is a world unfamiliar to AI. It is the understanding of these signs and symbols which our AI primarily lacks. It is what our AI does not know. And its lack of knowledge here allows us to problematize the role of signs in the construction of meaning. Let's go back to my StyleGAN training on the pocket watch, the azalea bush, the thief, and his chastity belt. Because I'm training the model on all four things at the same time, If the AI were familiar with the world of conventional signs, it would have to object to this training. It would immediately recognize that an azalea bush is not a chastity belt nor a thief. It would know that each object means very different things, or simply that they're different. At this point, it should discontinue its training, because this is clearly a misuse of the algorithm. This StyleGAN model is intentionally being mistrained, after all. But it, of course, doesn't object to learning the images it's being trained on. And in the process, it complicates things. In the manner of the remarkable combinatorial agility of language, it combines, it miscommunicates, it makes ambiguous, but it makes ambiguous with incredible clarity. It produces results that must be experienced unburdened by a system of signs and symbols, and it produces effects that are in excess of meaning. So this is the point where I return to literature and a short story that I think beautifully explains what happens when we try to detach semiotics from our sensibilities, when we are made to experience the world unmediated by signs. The story is called She Unnames Them, written by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a very short story, first appearing in The New Yorker in 1985, and it took up less than a page in the magazine. The story begins as the protagonist, who we realize later is Eve from the biblical book of Genesis, although she is never actually named in the story. And I mention it only because Eve coincidentally comes up later in the lecture. The story begins with her asking all the world's animals if they would like to give back their names. And with few exceptions, they do so with the, quote, perfect indifference with which they had so long accepted and ignored their names. And as she finishes unnaming them, she becomes aware of new insights into them and new traits shared between them. Traits that jumble categories, making, for instance, the hunter indistinguishable from the hunted, and attraction inseparable from fear. As the now nameless animals disperse and depart, they do so in this way. The insects parted with their names in vast clouds and swarms of ephemeral syllables, buzzing and stinging and humming and flitting and crawling and tunneling away. What she has done by unnaming things is make the world wholly aesthetic. She cannot describe the world anymore with common nouns, and instead must use gerunds: stinging, humming, flitting, blurring. The story ends with her walking away between the dark-branched, tall dancers, motionless against the winter shining. The trees and moon, now unnamed, are apprehended as pure aesthetic sensation, as qualia, those internal subjective components of perception. Finally, this is how our AI copes with the concerns of not knowing. Just as Donald Barthelme begins with those now familiar items, bush, thief, watch, and belt, we presented the same collection of things to our AI. And just as the writer finds himself, after each stab of his pen, not knowing, so does our AI. Our AI cannot represent the world through mimesis because it does not know the names of things. It cannot comprehend the collection presented to it by way of a priori knowledge of those things. Instead, it presents its efforts as uncanny blends of palpable imagery, loosed from any meaning or signification, what surrealists called authentic photographs of thought, that is, direct glimpses into the AI's prosthetic, machinic imagination. It rewrites the world into ineffable fictions with each new collection presented to it, and it remakes the world as utter optic sensations, pure aesthetics, fashioned without names, embracing that which is not known. So I want now to return to Eve and introduce the second essay, Machines à Rechercher. I began thinking about Eve more directly while doing research for this essay and coming across her story as I read about histories of curiosity. We're all familiar with the story of Eve succumbing to curiosity when she tasted the fruit from the tree of knowledge. But what interests me here are the events that unfolded immediately after she took that bite. The fruit was forbidden because of what would be disclosed with that bite. When she took the bite, the world was made more fully visible. She took the bite and suddenly recalled her nakedness. And this recollection echoes the concept of anamnesis, the unforgetting of some innate or inborn knowledge. So the reason I write these essays is to try to put my finger on that thing that's weird or remarkable or suggestive of new thoughts, to try to answer the question, what is it about these AI images that make them fundamentally different from other images? What is it about these AI images, perhaps, that allows them to enchant? And just like with the last essay, I trained a StyleGAN model to produce images for this essay. Images that might help me write the essay, images that might provide a kind of evidence for the ideas being proposed. And I trained, or more precisely mistrained, this StyleGAN model on Eve and her fruit. In this case, the elements collected for the training are what you might guess, aspects of Eve, her fruit, and in some of the training attempts, her provocateur. But what is the meaning of this word, anamnesis? Looking it up in the dictionary gets something like a recalling to mind or a reminiscence. But if we look more carefully, we find the roots men, to think, or meme, memory. Or more simply, and amnesis, forgetting, come together as unforgetting, which is awesomely not at all the same as remembering. And we'll see that this unforgetting is understood as a near mystical technique that variously claims to reveal hidden knowledge, to retrieve lost memories, and to produce the sublime in art. The first concern, the idea that certain types of knowledge must be recollected rather than learned, is an idea found in the epistemology of Plato. True knowledge, says Plato, is the kind one knows to be true without having to rely on sensory experience. And because you cannot get this kind of knowledge from experiencing the world, it must be a priori knowledge, meaning it first and already exists in the soul. Plato believed in an immortal soul that, because of its immortality, experiences multiple incarnations. And after reincarnation upon reincarnation, the soul ultimately learns all things. However, with each incarnation, the trauma of birth or rebirth causes one to forget everything. And the process of anamnesis is needed in order to recollect that lost knowledge. This lost knowledge is recovered, often involuntarily and spontaneously, through philosophical discourse and the dialectical method, or, as with Eve or Proust, through the experience of some material object. The famous story that Plato tells to illustrate his idea of anamnesis is from the dialogue Meno. In it, a slave boy comes to solve a problem in geometry with the help of Socrates, despite knowing nothing of geometry prior to this encounter. Socrates questions the boy and guides him through the problem without providing any direct instruction or information. Gradually, the boy is able to reason through the problem, eventually arriving at the correct solution. Plato, by way of Socrates, uses this example to show that because the boy was able to solve the problem without being taught the solution, he must already have possessed the knowledge and needed only to recollect it as an anamnesis. But what kind of knowledge is the sudden eruption of what has been lost? Can empirical knowledge or knowledge of things acquired through the senses also be lost and subsequently recovered? Wouldn't we have to consider that as well if we are to apply this concept of anamnesis to the artistic image? When that famous tea-soaked Madeleine triggered a flood of forgotten images from Marcel Proust's childhood, his experience of profound recollection must have been much like Eve's. Proust referred to this kind of remembering as mémoire involontaire, emphasizing that these recollections were not merely memories, but rather imaginative inventions born from involuntary memory. In other words, involuntary memory necessarily incorporates the faculty of imagination in its remembering. The torrent of recollections Proust experienced after the encounter with the cookie became the basis of his novel, In Search of Lost Time, and were written with such enormous detail and beauty that its effect is otherworldly. Proust's search, or recherche, is a search through the abyss of lost memory for what has been forgotten in time. In the attempt to relive his transcendent experience of sudden recollection, he creates a world in his novel that is conveyed more fully and aesthetically than any ordinary memory could produce. So what can Proust's recherche tell us about AI and memory? What might we say that these images, too, are a product of anamnesis, a product of the machine's involuntary memory? Throughout history, humans have sought ways to externalize memory through various technological means, from knots tied in rope and ornamental cathedral facades to books and photographs and signals stored on magnetic disks. These externalized memory devices have enabled us to store and access information beyond our biological capacities. And artificial intelligence is just the latest and most advanced episode in this long history of externalizing memory. However, unlike previous forms of externalized memory, AI-based image generation involves complex processes that go far beyond the straightforward retrieval of stored data. Instead of merely presenting stored images, AI algorithms transform that data into something new. In this way, the AI model, which has been tasked to remember the vast quantities of images offered to it, exhibits characteristics more closely resembling human memory. The process of learning and remembering that AI undergoes is laborious, highly iterative, and often quite revisionary. The images AI produces from its training can be extraordinary constructions that bear little resemblance to the images with which its artificial memory was built. Like Proust's novel of elaborate and beautifully constructed recollections, AI-produced images are the anamnesis of its own curiously trained artificial memory. As the concept of anamnesis continued to evolve, the 20th century saw the emergence of new interpretations and applications of this ancient idea, shedding light on the intricate relationship between memory, knowledge, and artistic expression. One notable figure concerned with the mysteries of anamnesis was the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Lacan explored the concept of the unconscious other, a sort of elusive lost object, perpetually hidden in one's unconscious, known only through the pleasurable associations it generates, which is interesting that the only evidence of this hidden memory, this lost object, this other, is a sensation of pleasure. For Lacan, anamnesis was a never-ending cycle of remembering and forgetting. The object of anamnesis repeatedly remembered, each time as if for the first time, only to be repeatedly forgotten. Jean-Francois Lyotard, another influential thinker of the 20th century, was similarly intrigued by the concept of anamnesis and extended these ideas into the realm of aesthetic theory. Lyotard explored the idea that there is an aspect of artistic expression that can never be fully captured or conveyed. He believed that this thing that is ineffable in art, a kind of other in the Lacanian sense, is encoded in the very process of painting or writing and resides in the unconscious aspect of the artistic medium itself. In other words, that thing that is forgotten or ineffable exists literally in the material of the paint, not in the signs and symbols, not in the representations in the works, but in the material itself. Engaging with art, then, initiates a process of rediscovering or remembering something previously hidden. The implication here is that the human viewer becomes the external machine for remembering something from the painting's unconscious. And so Lyotard uses the concept of anamnesis here to connect the unconscious elements of art and the human capacity for memory and recognition. And perhaps most importantly, Lyotard defines these experiences, the encounters with the unpresentable and the invisible made visible, as the sublime experience itself. Now, if, as Lyotard suggests, painting is the anamnesis of color and writing the anamnesis of words, a process of recollection and remaking through pigment, lines, and language, and if anamnesis is the search for the invisible in an event, then how might we reconsider AI, its artificial memory, and the images it produces? Can we say now that the AI-produced image is the result of a mechanized anamnesis, and that it both recognizes and does not the visual data that it was trained with? Can we say that it is in the failure to recognize, in that uncanny sensation of the unfamiliar, that the aesthetic excess is found? And is it in this excess that one senses the ungraspable other? AI-produced images seem to decompose its original data because of some untraceable influence in its training. So the odd hybrid figures that appear aren't just the accidental results of what has been forgotten, but are instead deliberate misunderstandings made in the frustrated attempts to remember. This mechanized anamnesis, the seeming effort to make visible some invisible labor in training, results in images that surprisingly echo Lyotard's definition of the sublime. And then there's Freud and his concept of working through, which I want to add here because it turns out to be a compelling model for understanding anamnesis as a technique of imagination. Freud wrote an essay called Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, where he examined the intricacies of recollection, differentiating between remembering, repeating, and working through as distinct modes of engaging with memory. Remembering is the most straightforward. Something merely forgotten can simply be remembered. Repeating, on the other hand, is a pathological acting out of repressed memories, which ultimately results in the subject being trapped in an endless, iterative cycle. And the cure for this repetitive disorder is Freud's working through. The technique of working through is sometimes described as listening to with a third ear to each fragment and feature of language uttered by the subject, however small and insignificant. The memory fragments produced here are then set next to one another with no consideration for their logic. It is an assembly without reason and therefore without meaning. As scraps of information appear, they become linked together and one feels as if one is approaching a scene. However, this scene is strange and disfigured. Working through becomes a search for the ungraspable, like Lyotard and Lacan's other. This process is also called rewriting, which for Lyotard is the anamnesis of what is invisible in thought. So this is not a technique for reconstructing memory. Instead, memory becomes the faculty that supplies the things with which the unanticipated and unexpected picture is made. This technique fascinatingly resembles the faculty of imagination. The parallels between anamnesis and how AI produces images are striking. AI models incorporate the principle of rewriting as they recall the data from their training. When we mistrained our StyleGAN model for Bartholomew's essay, Not Knowing, if you recall, the AI didn't object to learning the varied images it was trained on, despite their meaningful differences. The StyleGAN model for this essay was similarly mistrained. The objects of its training are also not at all the same as each other. And despite sharing features like color and texture or curvature, there are undeniable differences in physical characteristics, formal attributes, and meaning. These differences, these gaps that deny any accurate reconstruction or pure occurrence of memory, are how the AI creates something new. With each attempt at recollection, each effort to faithfully make visible what it has learned, the AI is doing the work of working through, of rewriting. It presents in each image an instance of an unstable reconstitution. This is the anamnesis of its training, the working through the resistance of the material it was trained with, so that each image it produces is, as Lyotard might call it, a presentation of the inexpressible. Finally, this working through, or rewriting, is also what Lyotard finds in Proust. Proust describes his first experience of anamnesis, his memoir Involontaire, the way I imagine an AI model would describe its training and its image production. That is, if AI were able to describe its anamnesis in words rather than images. I imagine AI laboring to make sense of its incongruous training, to find an answer in the disparate qualities in the mass of different images it is being asked to learn. And what of the involuntary and unconscious nature of Proust's memoir Involontaire? If those impressions from one's memory aren't consciously made, does the production of those uncanny images from the mistrained stylegan also require something like an unconscious? In its inability to reproduce the images it has been trained to learn and to remember, does it truly offer a model of a visual aesthetic anamnesis? So this is that famous passage from Proust's novel. You guys are probably reading it, but I'll read it to you too. No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with the crumbs touched my palate than a shiver ran through me and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary thing that was happening to me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, something isolated, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I sensed that it was connected with the taste of tea and cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savors, could not, indeed, be of the same nature. Where did it come from? What did it mean? How could I seize and apprehend it? I put down the cup and examined my own mind. It alone can discover the truth. But how? What an abyss of uncertainty. Whenever the mind feels overtaken by itself, when it, the seeker, is at the same time the dark region through which it must go seeking, and where all its equipment will avail it nothing. Seek, more than that, create. It is face to face with something which does not yet exist, which it alone can make actual, which it alone can bring into the light of day. And he's talking here about recollections, something that does not yet exist. As Proust is overwhelmed by his recollections, his conclusion is that he must both search, rechercher, and create to comprehend something which does not yet exist from his memories. Seek and create. So it is not just a search backward to retrieve the origin, it is a search forward to produce it. In the claim for anamnesis to be both a search for the unknown in memory and the production of fantastic images that result from this effort, is perhaps the bridge across that abyss of not knowing. Alternatively, it is a way to theorize imagination as a faculty that depends on forgetting, error, and the indescribable. This would truly position AI as an externalization and mechanization of imagination. But AI is also an instrument, even if an unpredictable one. Even though the stylegan model is trained on a finite set of data and has a permanent and retrievable memory, it rewrites its data into unexpected and highly aesthetic visual recollections. This repetitive production, the attempt to construct remembrance, is a model of imagination and artistic creation for both AI and for us. With its inability to faithfully represent what it has been trained to know, AI-produced images come to share qualities with the memories in Proust's prose, quote, redolent with sensation and rich with reflection. The rewriting of its training, the continual reassembling of aesthetic impressions, of the visible details and features of its memories produce strange visual idioms. In AI-produced images, bits, parts, and features are remembered and reconstituted and come to mean something very different than what those parts and features mean on their own and in their original context. But what is the new meaning? If it is an expression of the inexpressible, it is also an affirmation, as it was for Eve, of the desire to gain knowledge of the unknown. As Lyotard writes, quote, visual art emancipates the vision imprisoned in sight and makes one feel as if one's eyes have been abandoned. The images produced by AI are examples of this emancipation, and the so-called ungraspable other that ultimately appears does so vividly. And that's all I got.